Before we begin, I want to dedicate the Torah class today in the merit of the speedy recovery of Rabbi Aharon Yehuda Leib ben Gittel Fega. This is the preeminent sage and scholar in the world, and I always like to look at him and his colleagues and peers as examples of the power of Torah. In no other arena of excellence do we have people that are at the peak of their world-class performers that are, over 80. In Exxon, they make you retire at 65. Because once you hit 65, that's it. You're done. Mandatory retirement age. This rabbi, who I'm talking about, who's ill, who's in the hospital now, he's 104. And he's absolutely at the peak of his game. And it's amazing what the Torah does. It just transforms someone into a totally different person. And it gives him these superhuman capabilities. But he's ill, and the entire Jewish world, including the secular politicians in Israel, they made a special prayer session in merit of his recovery. So I'd like to dedicate our Torah class today in merit of his recovery as well. This week's Parsha is Parshas Bo. Bo means to come, and the Almighty instructs Moshe to come to Pharaoh because I made his heart heavy, or hardened his heart, and the heart of his people, in order that I could put these miracles and signs in their midst. Now, Pharaoh is becoming a believer, almost against his will. He's almost being forced into it. He's being handcuffed into faith. And I was thinking there's a little bit of a pattern here. The first 5 plagues, Pharaoh himself hardens his own heart. Like we mentioned last week, Pharaoh had a predisposition towards hardening himself. But you'll notice after 5 plagues of him hardening his own heart, he has to have God harden his heart. And what changed? So I think there's a little bit of a pattern. If you look at the 6 plagues, boils. How did the boils plague begin? Moshe takes a handful of soot, of coals, of ashes, throws it up in front of Pharaoh, and the entire Egypt is blanketed in boils. Both humans and animals. And that's an obvious, undeniable miracle. There's no way to say that, this was some naturally occurring phenomenon. There happened to have been something that just happened. You just haven't gotten very lucky. And once it becomes undeniable, and really there's no way out, then Pharaoh, even though he would have wanted to harden his own heart, he was unable to. The next plague is hail. And we're told specifically that it was a hail never before seen in the land of Egypt and never again to be seen. It means it was something so unprecedented, so out of the ordinary, that there was no comparable event, and therefore, again, Pharaoh was not able to, even though he would have wanted to harden his heart. And we're going to begin again with in this week's parsha with the final 3, and beginning with locusts. Again, we're told by locusts that it was never before seen a plague like this in the land of Egypt. Of course, darkness, just where for 7 days you don't have any sun or any light or anything like that. And of course, death of the firstborn, all simultaneously. These are undeniable phenomena. And it's interesting to note, Pharaoh himself is trying as best as he can to deny the miracles and deny the fact that God is ultimately in control, even when he's being forced into it. And that's going to be a theme that's threading its way throughout the parsha. So, in the run-up to this 8th plague of locust, the Almighty sets out the objective. And this is, again, another theme throughout this parsha. Look at verse 2. Why am I going to make these miracles? So that you may relate in the ears of your son and your son's son that I made a mockery of Egypt and my signs that I placed among them, that you may know that I am Hashem. And this we see again and again. These events are the events that we perpetuate to future generations. This is what we tell our kids about. Our kids tell their kids, and it goes on for eternity. These events, and not only that, this is what leads us that we should know that Hashem is God. Our faith is substantiated upon this revelation or these revelations. And indeed, our nation is based upon, it begins here. This is where it begins, as we'll see some other examples of that as well. And it begins with these revelations of faith that are really going to inspire the Jews from then onward. Moreover, we see that what is the requirements of faith? In modern day parlance, faith is something that you have to kind of feel in your heart. You feel faith or you don't feel faith, and that's why it's somewhat fickle. If you look at this verse, it says we have to know that I am Hashem. The visuals, the imagery, what we're going to encounter with these plagues is going to be so striking. It's going to have a sensory impact, and it's going to make it that we know that Hashem exists. It's not going to be merely an article of faith. And the difference is that when someone has faith based upon feelings, feelings can be swayed. You can feel one day one thing, the next day you can feel something else. And therefore, what's going to ensure that your faith in God is not going to be subject to the whims or to the way the wind is blowing? And that's, how can we substantiate anything real upon such weak foundations? But if your foundations, if your faith is based upon what you know, what you've proven, what is evidence-based, what's empirical, well, then even if things are happening and you don't feel great one day, still what's fact is fact. Someone could be having a miserable day and they should be upset at the world, but oxygen still fills their lungs, right? And they still don't deny that. And the sky is still blue. If we transform our faith into the way they had it, that it's based upon evidence, it's facts, what we know, then it's not subject to what, bad things happen to good people. That, where's the faith? Faith can be challenged. Well, is oxygen challenged? How come no one challenges because that's a fact. That's what we know. That's true. That's undeniable. That's what they achieved at the Exodus, and that's what we can achieve as well, because we're going to perpetuate this, and this was perpetuated to us, and we can reflect back upon that, and that could build, hopefully for us, a very strong edifice of faith for us. Now, it's also interesting that part of the goal of these plagues is to make a mockery of Pharaoh. And it's an interesting use of term. Why is it not enough to just tell Pharaoh, to have him, we want him to be humbled, and we wanted, there has to be a mockery of Pharaoh. It's a little bit of a strange thing, but I do believe that there's a powerful lesson over here. Pharaoh is someone who is a measly human, where they have a 60 or 70, maybe 100-year lifespan, and then they put their body in the ground, and worms gnaw at it. It's like, it's a joke. And he's standing up to God. It's like if you had an ant on the floor who's coming to you and wagging his finger, brandishing, is threatening you. It's an absolute hilarious joke. And Pharaoh is standing before God and saying, who is this God? I don't believe it. And God's humbling him again. And it's really funny. It's humorous to think where Pharaoh had come from, where Moshe comes and introduces this notion, who's God? And he starts laughing at them. Oh, you do a miracle? Oh, I'll pull in my magicians. They'll do the same thing. And that's where it starts and where it's going to end, where Pharaoh is going to be progressively humbled again and again. It's really humorous, the clash of the eternal with the transient and the illusions of someone like Pharaoh is really, it does have a element of humor in it. And that continues, by the way, verse 3, Moshe and Aaron came to Pharaoh and they said to him, so said Hashem, the God of the Hebrews, till when do you refuse to be humbled before me? Send my people so that they may worship me. I was thinking, imagine the Jewish people are enslaved in Stalin's Russia, or in Putin's Russia for that matter. And, you're Moshe and you're going to try to lobby in favor of their release. And you tell the leader, why do you refuse to be humbled? It's pretty remarkable what they're asking of Pharaoh, but really, that's what has to happen. The plagues are not merely a means to allow the people to escape. Like we said, if that was the plague, they would have left after the 5th plague. Once Pharaoh capitulated, there's no need to harden his heart. There is a need, however, for Pharaoh to be humbled because of the powerful impact that that's going to have on the Jewish people. The Jewish people previously had their allegiances to Pharaoh. They were subject to him, and they had become modified to look at Pharaoh as their master. Now they see Pharaoh humbled before God, and they realize that Pharaoh himself has an overlord. And Moshe and Aaron introduce the next plague, and that's a locust swarm. And it's going to be so vast and so complete and so powerful and so tremendous, it's going to cover everything. And all the produce that was salvaged from the hail is going to be swept up by the swarm. It's going to consume everything. It's going to be such a vast swarm of locusts, never seen before and never seen since. They told Pharaoh what happened, what's going to happen, and they left. Pharaoh's people, they already get the message. They see that Moshe has been uncanny in his predictions, and the once mighty empire of Egypt is crumbling. So they say to him, how long will this be a snare for us? How long will we have to suffer? Let's let them go already. Why do we need to do that? So they summon Moshe and Aaron back, and they say, okay, I have a deal. Let's make a deal. You know who was it? Let you go. And, but who exactly do you want to take with you? You guys want to go on a 3-day retreat to bring sacrifices to God? Well, okay, who's going to go? So, Moshe responds, young people, old people, sons, daughter, the flock, the cattle. It's going to be a huge festival. Everyone and everything is coming. So Pharaoh says to them, never going to happen. How are you going to go with your kids? Look, the evil intent is opposite your eyes. I have a different proposal. Let the men go. The men are going to want to do the worshiping of God. Everyone else could stay here. And he said, if you don't like the terms, you can leave. Again, we see Pharaoh thinks that he has some sort of leverage. It's common for us. We get used to we get in our own little world and we forget about God. So we assume people have real power and they have leverage when it's just an illusion. Pharaoh's like, I'm the king. You're coming to me and you're asking me to do something. I'm giving you an offer. You take it or leave it. And Moshe's like, you're a joke. This is a mockery. Who are you? You have no power. You're a little ant who's brandishing a tiny little stick and coming to threaten me. It's silly. And you still believe that we're somewhat subject to your ideas and to your limitations. Now it's interesting here. He says, look, the evil intent is opposite your faces. Re'u ki ra'a neged penechem. There's something bad. Why you want to go? There's something bad in your destiny. That's what he says. Now there's a very interesting Rashi here. Rashi says a midrash. He quotes a midrash, an Agadic midrash, and he says there's some sort of star that is called Ra'a, and Pharaoh tells Moshe, I see with my astrological acuity that there's some bad things. If you're going to go, you're going to hit some. There's a force called Ra'ah that's in front of you, and if you go into the desert, you're going to have a lot of bloodshed. And what actually happened, once the people actually left, and they sinned with the golden calf, again, spoiler alert, and God wanted to destroy the Jewish people, and Moshe said to God, remember when Pharaoh threatened, there's this bad thing before you, you don't want the Egyptians to say that God took them out bira'ah, with this power. And therefore, God transformed that the blood is not one of bloodshed, the blood is one of a mitzvah, i.e. the mitzvah of circumcision. That's what Rashi says. Pretty remarkable idea. And I think the lesson is sometimes the destiny is set. Pharaoh saw something that was accurate. He saw that there's bloodshed in the future. In his mind, he connected the dots And he said that the only way to get there is through a very bad result. Bloodshed, what does that mean? It sounds very bad. And the truth is that he was right about the result. There was bloodshed, but it was the good kind of bloodshed. It was a bloodshed of a mitzvah, a bloodshed of celebration. I think, there's a broader lesson here. There's, of course, a nationalistic lesson. We're told in the Talmud that the Messiah will only come either in a generation that's entirely righteous or in a generation that's entirely wicked. What this means is that the result is fixed. Messiah is going to come. However, the path, that's up to us. It could be a path of entirely righteous. We could earn the result. Or it could be a path of entirely wickedness. The result can come despite our behavior. Now, those are vastly different experiences, even though the result is the same. There's another example on a more personal, individualistic level. This is a good pedagogical lesson. The Talmud says that there are certain kids that are born with certain instincts that are innate and immutable. For example, the Talmud says that there are some kids that are going to be ones that do bloodshed. But what kind of bloodshed is, it depends on their choices. They could be a mohel, a ritual surgeon for circumcision. They could be a surgeon, a physician. They could be a butcher, or they could be a thief/murderer. The result's the same. The result is they're the ones who need to do bloodshed. I would surmise that those kids that like to dismember daddy long legs, you know those kids? And that they do from a very young age, they have a tendency towards violence. They like blood. Whereas the other kids, they see blood and they start gagging. And the nature of the child is fixed. The result is the same. There is bloodshed. How you get there, and do you utilize that for a mitzvah, or do you utilize that for a sin? Well, that's the free will of every person. But it's a good lesson for us as, I would say, parents and educators, that sometimes a kid is heading on a path towards a fixed destination. You can change the destination, but you could change, is that a good destination or is it a bad destination? Are you utilizing their qualities for good? Are you channeling them in a way that they are able to take what they have as fixed and use it in the proper setting or not? So Moshe stretched out his hand, and a swarm of locusts come. They sweep up everything, and the whole night and day, there's this wind that brings the entire locust, and it totally covers everything. It covers the eye of the land, and it was darkness. And if you ever see, you can watch some of the videos online of a swarm of locusts. It's just millions and billions of tiny little grasshoppers that fly in these swarms and consume absolutely everything along their path. But it's, there's so many of them that you actually can't see the sun. You actually try to look through them. It's, there's just such a perpetual flow of the locust, of the grasshoppers, that you can't actually see the sun. And the way it describes here, that there was darkness upon the land because there were so many locusts, and it was just covering the sun. Of course, Pharaoh gets all freaked out, calls back to Moshe and Aaron. I sinned to God, I sinned to you. Why don't you pray and remove this terrible death? And they leave and they start praying, and the Almighty makes another wind that takes the locust and sends it all away. And verse 19 ends that there was not a single locust found in the entire border of Egypt. And this is interesting, because this is an illustration of how God acts. What does it mean that there was not even a single locust left in the land of Egypt? So locust is actually something that people like to eat. So you would take locust, and it's kind of crunchy, I would imagine. Actually, locust is actually kosher. And in the Sephardic communities, they still have a tradition which locusts they eat, which ones they don't. So what happened is that the people in Egypt who like to eat locusts, they say, hey, it's terrible, locusts swept and ate everything, but let's try to take a net out and grab a whole bunch of them. At least we'll have a decent meal after this is done. So they they grab a net and scoop up a whole bunch of them, and the way it's described here, they put it on salt, i.e. they preserve it. And these are dead locusts. When it says that God swept all the locusts away, there was not even one left, that's referring to even the ones that they wanted to stay, even those were swept away. And I think this is a good illustration of how the Almighty operates. When the Almighty operates, everything's done with precision, and everything is done completely. If you remember last week, we talked about the frogs. Moshe prayed that only the frogs of the plague should die. Because had he prayed that all the frogs should die, then every single frog in the world would have died. Because that's what happens. You ask God for something, you get what you ask for sometimes. And therefore, you want to make sure that you don't want to make frogs go extinct. You just want to stop the plague. Here, Moshe prayed that all the locusts in Egypt should be removed, and indeed it was, and even the ones that people had intended to keep, that went with it as well. And of course, God hardens his heart, and he doesn't send the people out. And the 9th plague begins right away. And by the way, there's a pattern. The first 9 plagues are 3 sets of 3. And the first 2 of each 3, i.e. 1, 2, 4, 5, and 7, 8, are forewarned. Whereas the 3rd, the 6th, and the 9th are done without warning. So Pharaoh was never warned about the 9th plague of darkness. And God tells Moshe, stretch out your hand, and it'll be darkness. Moreover, the darkness will be tangible. So this is nothing we've ever experienced. I had a physicist at my house recently, and I asked him, well, what would it be like inside a dark hole? He's going to be very dark, apparently. Hence the name. But I think that's what it was kind of like. You know, we think of darkness in only relative terms. If you're at night, and it's very dark, and there's no lights, but actually, if you stay there for about a half hour, you'll be able to see somewhat in darkness. Because it's not black, it's kind of like really dark charcoal or gray. That's what it really is. You could still see. I know my father is a pilot of little Cessna planes. So one of the rules when you fly as a pilot is that when you fly at night, you have to be able to see, because you don't want to fly of course, you have the computers to help you navigate as well, instruments as well. But he said that the rule is that if you don't have any light, any artificial light for a half hour, then the FAA considers that you could see at night. But if you turn on a little spotlight, you have to start the half hour once more. What this means is that darkness is all relative. So if you have light and then you come to darkness, then you're not used to it. You can't see anything. But if you get accustomed to the darkness, of course, your eyes expand to pull in whatever light there is at night, and you could actually see. You could see in the dark. This darkness was an entirely different darkness. It was absolute blackness, total non-vision. Moreover, it was also palpable. You could actually feel it. There was a condition that was not just absence of light. It was the presence of some other force that actually froze people in place. It was such a thick blanket of darkness that the people were frozen in place. Verse 23, no man can see his brother, nor can anyone rise from his place for a 3-day period. But for all the children of Israel, there was light in their dwellings. They didn't have this plague. Now, Rashi tells us something very interesting here. Rashi says, why was there the plague of darkness? He gives 2 reasons. First of all, because in a few short weeks, the Jews are going to go and borrow, with air quotes, they're going to borrow vessels from their neighbors. They're going to go say, we're going on this pilgrimage. We want to have a lot of gold and silver. Can I borrow it? And we'll see in this week's parasha that the Almighty will give the appeal of the Jews to their neighbors. And therefore, even though it may be imprudent to lend your erstwhile slave who's going on a pilgrimage your gold and silver and jewelry, but they did it anyhow. But what's going to happen is that you're going to go to your neighbor and say, hey, can I borrow your gold watch? I'd like to borrow your necklace. I'd like to borrow your bracelet. Maybe some fancy china. I'd like to borrow it for my trip. He says, me? I'm destitute. I don't have anything. And you'll tell him, oh, actually, I actually remember when you were frozen in place, I walked into your house and I looked through your drawers and I saw that you have a nice Rolex and you have this nice, really gold and diamond necklace. I actually saw that. And they'll say, and they'll have to lend it to them. That's one reason. And that's why there was darkness, but the Jews could see, so they could rummage through the stuff of their neighbors to know what to ask for when they want to borrow stuff. That's the second reason brought in Rashi. The first reason, so this is interesting, but the first reason is that during this time, there were, it was very clear to everyone that this is going to reach some sort of climax that's going to amount to the Jews leaving. But if you think about it, the Jews were there for hundreds of years. They established deep roots in the land. They have their kids go to school there, and they're second-class citizens. Yes, they're tormented, but this is what they know. This is where they live. And Moshe is coming and saying, we're just going to some other land. We're going to walk with our kids, with a whole multitude of people, into the desert. It's pretty perilous. And you would say, I don't know, you're just walking into the wilderness with Moshe. A lot of people didn't want to go. And what happened to those people? Those people died. When did they die? They died during the plague of darkness. Because we don't want the Egyptians saying, oh, we're suffering, you guys are suffering as well. In order for the Egyptians to not notice, to not see what's happening to some of the Jews who are choosing to not join the nation, therefore there was darkness and they were totally oblivious to everything that happened. That's the other reason in Rashi. And I think about this. We have a country in Israel. And this was the dream of all our grandparents. They prayed for it for thousands of years. And they're hoping maybe they could go visit Israel once. And maybe they could live there. And that's what they all yearned for. And now there's a country in Israel. And it's a modern first world country. It's got a booming economy. It's a nice place. It's safe. It's a good place to live. And what's happening to the Jews in America? And I'm guilty as everyone else is. We're living here in comfort. We're very happy. We have our house, we have our mortgage, we have our job. We're very happy, we're very content here. And it's a little bit of an indictment upon us, because what about our fact that, we finally got what we wanted? We got the card. We're allowed to leave Egypt. It's going to happen. Everything you dreamed about, it's happening. And you're like, I don't know if I'm ready. Maybe I want to stay here a little bit. And I was thinking, to a certain degree, the same thing applies to our generation. Like, we have the land of Israel. We have a state there. It's a wonderful country. It's booming. It's flourishing. It's fully developed. And we choose to stay here. And I don't know if history will look kindly upon us. I don't know. I'm not trying to ascribe any guilt to anyone, but, and I'm as guilty as anyone else is. But it is interesting that Jews in America have chosen, or a lot of them have chosen, to say, yes, we're not participating. And I hope that, I think we should at least have this idea in our head. We have a nation, we have a country that we belong to. I think that's a step one. Step two maybe is like, at least have some sort of dream that maybe we could go, maybe we'll retire in Israel. They have a world-class golf course in Caesarea. I always make the joke that Israel cannot have a full 18-hole golf course. Because if it was fully 18 holes, part of it would be in Jordan. It's so small. That's the joke. When Ezra led the return to Israel from Babylon at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, also, he only took with him 42,000 people, around 42,000 people. Even the majority of Jews had settled in Babylon. They were very comfortable there. They had built a nice Jewish communities there, and they wanted to stay there. And they stayed there for thousands of years. The community of Babylon was extant until the 20th century. And the Talmud quotes one of the rabbis, for example, who had severe problems with it. How do you not join Jewish people back in Israel, and you want to stay in Babylon? And I'm saying, so it's not a new criticism, and it's certainly not a new feeling, but it is, I think, something to think about. To think about the fact that we should at least have the notion or the theory that we're not home, and we have a home right now. We're kind of temporarily here, and we're working out some kinks before we get our affairs in order and we move to our permanent home. Even if that's just a pipe dream, I think it's a good thought to at least bounce around there. People will sometimes prefer what they know to the unknown. And there are people that have wanted to go back to prison because the prison, they had a regimented system and they had their people, and yes, it was prison, but they'd still prefer that. And even the Jews that did leave and were excited to leave, it's not very easy to say, I'm going to live with this heightened level of spiritual realism. That's a significant challenge. There's an interesting note here, or just an interesting idea here. So all the Egyptians have darkness, the Jews have light. And I think this really does hammer home the idea that everyone is really living in their own world. And this is, of course, a theme throughout the plague narrative that, there's blood for the Egyptians. The Jew has a glass of water. Each one of them sticks a straw into the glass of water, and the Jew sucks out the water, and the Egyptian sucks out blood. And that's what would happen. And it's teaching them that each one of us is living in our own world. There's a Mishnah that says that every human has to declare, the world was created for me. Now that, of course, can be skewed to say everyone has to serve me because the world created for me. But the idea is that the real lesson is that everyone has their own world. And everyone's responsible for their own world. Adam was created. It was just Adam. He's the only man. And thus, the whole world is worth it. The entire infrastructure is worth it for one man. So the fact that there's multiple men, there's millions of humans, billions of humans, it just happens to be that each one of us with our individual world, we all happen to be coexisting. All these worlds are coexisting in the same grand place, location. But each one of us are our own individuals. And indeed, during these plagues, this was a powerful lesson where every Jew realizes that God treats me as an individual. And God treats my neighbor, who's the Egyptian, as an individual. My other neighbor is a Jew, also as an individual. And that's a very powerful element of faith, to know that God doesn't, there's no block grants. God treats everyone every human at least, as an individual, and that is part of the grand lessons of faith of the plagues. So again, Pharaoh calls Moshe, and again he's under the illusion that he has some sort of negotiating power. He says, "Okay, go take your kids with you, but leave your flock and cattle as a collateral. I'm willing to let you send your kids with your flock and cattle." So Moshe tells him, not only are you going to let us take our cattle, you're going to send with us cattle that you want to donate to the procession. And again, God hardens his heart, and he does not seek to send them. And then Pharaoh makes the first threat to Moshe. He tells him he's not happy with what he hears. And he tells Moshe, if you ever come before me again, I'm going to kill you. And Moshe says, you're right, I'm not going to come to you. Next time, you're going to come to me. I'm not going to have to chase you down. You'll have to chase me down. And while Moshe's there, this is the only time, this is the exception where God gives Moshe a prophecy in Egypt. Normally Moshe would go out of Egypt, out of the atmosphere that's full of idolatry, to have a prophecy. But because this is the last time that Moshe and Pharaoh are going to be speaking before Pharaoh comes and kicks the Jews out, he has a prophecy then and he conveys it to Pharaoh, and that's the warning of the death of the firstborn. And I think this is interesting. I once heard a story, I don't remember the details, but someone quoted a teaching that says in the days of the Messiah, all the kings are going to themselves are going to kneel before the Messiah. That's what it says. And then one king said to one of the rabbis, he said to him, well, what if I don't, quote unquote, bend the knee? What then? He says, if you don't bend the knee, then obviously it's not the Messiah. This is interesting. Like, Pharaoh tells Moshe, he has his terms. So the illusion of Pharaoh having any power is still present. And Moshe tells him, no, we're not going to leave on your terms. You're not going to hold our livestock hostage. You're actually going to contribute towards it. And Pharaoh can't imagine on what setting would Pharaoh want to contribute towards the loss of his, right, the one thing that he's been striving to prevent. It's inconceivable. How is it possible that the United Nations, every one of them, they're all going to accept God and all going to accept Torah and accept the Jewish people as God's chosen people? How's that going to happen? Their whole life, everything they're trying to do is to prevent that. It's not going to be on their terms. It's the same thing. The model is the same. They think they have leverage, that they have control. The truth is God has all the control. Everything. They're a bunch of puppets. They're a bunch of little tiny insects. They have no power. Nothing whatsoever. They have the illusion of power. When the time comes, and they're going to see what they really are, and they're the ones that are going to contribute as well. How are we going to build a temple in Temple Mount? How are we going to do that? What do you mean? You know what the big deal they're going to make with the United Nations? No, they're a bunch of clowns. They're a bunch of puppets. They have no power. They're going to contribute towards the gold and the silver needed. Everyone's going to come and say, how do we help? That's what's going to happen. Right? And if that doesn't happen, then we know we haven't reached the destination quite yet. So Moshe tells Pharaoh that there's one more, or God tells Moshe that Moshe can raise to Pharaoh, there's one more plague that I'm going to bring to Pharaoh into all of Egypt, and then he's going to send you away, and totally, he's going to evict you. He's going to drive you out of the land. But first, make sure you borrow gold and silver vessels, and and here we see that God's going to give the favor of the Jews in the eyes of their neighbors, so they're going to lend them. And Moshe conveys to Pharaoh, around midnight, God is going to come through the land of Egypt, and all the firstborn are going to die. Firstborn of Pharaoh, firstborn of the midwife, the maidservant, the firstborn of the animals. All the firstborn are going to die. And it's going to be a tremendous cry. It's going to be terrible wailing, terrible tragedy. But amongst the Jewish people, not even a dog is going to bark. It's going to be absolute silence and tranquility. There's going to be no noise and no distractions. So this is a few interesting things here. First of all, if you look at Moshe's instruction or his prediction to Pharaoh, he says to him at around midnight. But when the story actually happens, it's exactly at midnight. So why does Moshe tell him at around midnight? And the answer is because Pharaoh was the ultimate cynic. Imagine Pharaoh had his atomic clock, and he was looking at the clock, and he was saying, and at exactly midnight, all the firstborn died. But in his clock, his clock was a half a second off. So it said at 11:59 and 59 and a half seconds. Pharaoh would say, you guys were wrong. You said midnight. It wasn't exactly midnight. If Pharaoh had any reason to be cynical and to doubt and to be skeptical and dubious, no matter how overwhelming the prediction is and how precise it was, because of his flawed methodologies of time collecting, he would have flatly rejected, even though hundreds of thousands of people are dying around the same time. Certainly, it's still powerful enough, but he said, you were inaccurate. And therefore, when he tells Pharaoh, he's like, at around midnight-ish, all the firstborn died. And in truth, it was precisely at midnight when they died, but we see Pharaoh has this tendency, regardless of how overwhelming the evidence is, he's going to always try to find a poke hole. He's not someone who's willing to accept the truth for what it is. He's an ultimate cynic and he's looking for reasons to reject it. Now, by the way, as an aside, how do the people die exactly at midnight? Right? There is no time that's called midnight. It's either before midnight or right away after midnight. So when did they die? It's their question, right? Midnight is just a marker between the time beforehand and the time afterwards. So it says that they died at midnight exactly. How is that possible? It's their question. A little bit of a brain teaser. And the answer is, well, the people were alive until midnight, and then precisely after midnight, they were already dead. Indeed, there's no time of midnight, but there's no time of death. You're either alive or you're dead. They were alive prior to midnight, and they were dead after midnight. Now, what's this notion of the dogs are not barking? Really strange idea. It's quiet and the dogs aren't barking. And by the way, we know, but there is this tradition, certainly if there's a mad dog, it's a wild dog, a rabid dog, you say this verse. Amongst the Jews, there's no dog barking, no dog coming after anyone, and it's supposed to quell the advances of a rabid dog. I don't know. But what's this idea that there's no dog barking? Really strange idea. So I saw something very fascinating. A dog is used in Jewish literature as the epitome of chutzpah. And the reason why is because why does a dog have chutzpah? Because a dog has a very powerful sense of smell. And the sense of smell is the sense most associated with the soul. For example, after Shabbat is over, Shabbat is where we have an expanded soul. After Shabbat is over, we console the soul by smelling the besamim, the spices, which is a way to invoke the soul. When Isaac encountered Jacob, who he thought was Esau, he remarks how the smell is like the smell of the garden of Hashem. The smell is always associated with the soul, with spirituality. The reason why the animal has chutzpah is because the animal says, look at me, I have a more powerful, developed sense of smell than the human. I'm better than them. And that's why when a dog barks on a spiritualistic kind of esoteric level, what it means is the dog is saying, look at me, I'm better than you because I have a more developed sense of smell, which is the spiritual sense, and therefore I'm better than you. But at this point in time, the dog stopped barking. What's going to happen to the Jewish people at midnight, at this revelation, is even the dogs who hitherto had believed that they're more spiritually developed than the Jewish people, they stopped. They didn't bark anymore. And the reason why they didn't bark anymore, because now it became clear the heightened spiritual nature and status of the nation, and even the dogs no longer had the temerity to even suggest that they're more spiritually advanced than the Jews. Okay, so Moshe tells Pharaoh about the pending death of the firstborn, and he storms out. God tells Moshe, Pharaoh's not going to be impressed. In order that I could do more miracles, Pharaoh doesn't send the people. And then chapter 12 is the beginning of mitzvos. We start getting a whole litany of mitzvos, which doesn't really end until the Torah ends. And if you look at the first Rashi in the Torah, the first commentary Rashi in the very first verse in the Torah, he asks a question: why does the Torah not start from chapter 12, verse 1 of Exodus? This, according to Rashi, at least in the question, this ought to be an appropriate starting point to the Torah, because here's we start to get the first mitzvos of the Torah. So the answer is that there's lessons that are inherent in the previous parts of the Torah. But the truth is, well, at least the theory behind the question is that Torah, the word Torah means instruction. Well, when do the instructions actually start? It starts over here. And therefore...
Didn't it start with circumcision?
Yes, okay, so interspersed earlier there are some instructions. But bring them over here, I'm saying. We can find a way to edit those later on. But, of course Rashi's not trying to suggest to alter the text. but he's trying to bring out a point. The point is that the Torah is a book of instructions. When we read stories, they're not historical anecdotes. They're instructions that are presented in a story form. Not to say that they're not historical. It means that the goal is not the historical element of it. The goal is the lesson, and i.e. the Torah within it. Here we start getting very practical with mitzvahs that are relevant to us in the way they're presented. We don't have to draw out the lesson. We just learn the mitzvah. And thus, this is a little bit of a change. Of course, there's going to be a lot of narrative and story telling from here on as well. But here is where we start to get the mitzvahs in rapid fire. So the first mitzvah is the mitzvah of the Rosh Chodesh, of the new month. And this is an interesting mitzvah because this, well, first of all, I think this shows somewhat of the power of Torah. We have we accepted for ourselves a very complicated task, and that is to adopt a lunar month, but to maintain a solar year. So our month is controlled by the moon. Every revolution of the moon is a new month, and every revolution of the earth around the sun is a new year. And to balance those two, we're the only ones that do that. And the reason why we're the only ones that do that, because the only ones that had God's instructions of how to do that were us. And that's why the Muslims, for example, they follow a lunar month and a lunar year. So all of their holidays can be in the summer, in the winter, in the spring, in the fall. They're all over the place because every year the lunar year is 11 days shorter than the solar year. A lunar month is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3.34 seconds. Now, the reason why we know that is not because we sent out the Hubble telescope or something like that. It's because the Torah says it. And that's a very precise measure, the one we still use today. Now, oh yeah. Well, I'm saying the Torah doesn't go through the mathematics, but the Torah goes through the structure. The details are part of the oral Torah. But again, how did they know that? How did they know this in the oral Torah? But here we're told we have to follow the lunar month, but critically, the holiday of Passover, that of course is the mitzvah that we're going to commemorate the Exodus, that has to be done in the springtime. So the fact that the holiday of Passover is on the 15th day of Nisan, but it's always in the spring, that creates the whole mathematical problems of how you balance these two. The way you actually do it is, so every lunar month is 29 and a half days. So is it a 29-day month or a 30-day month? So it's roughly 50-50. But it's a little more, so it's a little slightly more often it's a 30-day month because there's still 44 minutes and 3 point some odd seconds that you need to account for. Now you have a solar year that's 365 days plus 5 hours and 55 minutes. You have to find a way to make those two balance, and it's mind-boggling, the complexity. The way they actually do it is a 247-year cycle, broken down into 13 cycles of 19 years, broken down to 91 leap months. 7 times every 19 years, we have an extra month of Adar. Last year, we had an extra month of Adar. This year, we don't have. But if you actually do that, you can do this for infinity. You have a 247-year cycle, broken down into 13 cycles of 19 years, 7 leap years within every 19 years, 91 leap years, i.e. 91 extra months out of this 247 years, and it's all down to precision. To me, it's always interesting, like how, if someone did not, like, how did primitive, or at least scientifically primitive people who didn't have access to all the things that we have, how do they know how to do this in a way that is entirely precise down to the millisecond? I don't know. I'm saying it's God. And this is where we get the mitzvah. And this is the first mitzvah given. It's pretty remarkable. Pretty impressive. And I would say it's a question. The people that question the divinity of the Torah, how do they reconcile that? How is it possible that a bunch of random Joes who allegedly wrote the Torah or cobbled together various folklore and fairy tales, and everything was just a hodgepodge of myths that was put together by some redactor, how do they reconcile when they see mitzvos that were applied mitzvos that are done with such precision and in a way that really we know today is verifiably accurate? It's pretty remarkable. That's the first mitzvah, to establish the new month, the new moon, and to have a calendar. And the calendar, in fact, is one of the things that was banned. Antiochus and the Syrian Greeks, when they made their assault on Torah, one of the mitzvahs that they forbade was the mitzvah of establishing the new month. Because this is the one thing that really keeps the religion together. If you don't have the regulation of the calendar, you don't know when Yom Kippur is, you don't know when Rosh Hashanah is, you don't know when Passover is, and then you have a splintered people, and the nation disintegrates. But this is, ready for the times of Moshe. We're already doing this. This is the mitzvah that we are doing. Pretty impressive. And then we're told, of course, the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach, of the Passover offering, which essentially means it's what we recreate in our Passover Seders. It's the celebration of the eve of Passover, and they have to take a lamb or a kid, a sheep, for the family. And the way this worked is that every group of people got together and they split up an animal, and they would have the meal together, all ready to go. They have their backpacks on, they got their staff on, they have their liters of water, they had those backpacks with the water. Yeah, those little things that are called the camels. They're all ready to go. And then everyone's all dressed and ready to go, and they take this animal and get ready to have a celebration before they leave. Now, when do they separate this animal? They have to separate it on the 10th day of Nisan. And on the 14th day of Nisan, they slaughter it and they prepare it for the feast of that evening. And they have to roast it, and they have to eat matzos, and they have to have maror, all the things that we do on the Seder Eve, the first night of Pesach. You're not allowed to cook it. It has to be roasted, and you can't have any leftover. You have to eat it all before the morning, and you eat it while you're ready to go. So that's the mitzvah. Now, it's interesting here that the only time this mitzvah was done, so long as the temple was extant, they had a mitzvah to take an animal before the holiday of Passover and sacrifice it and eat it in celebration the night of Passover. And our Seder today is modeled after that celebration. Now, in Egypt, they had an extra mitzvah, and that mitzvah was to take it on the 10th of the month and guard it for 4 days so it doesn't get a blemish. And there's an interesting Rashi here that tells us, why did they have to guard it for 4 days in Egypt? Because they're about to leave, and they're about to have this momentous spiritual revelation, but they don't have any mitzvos. And therefore God created a special mitzvah that they should take the animal and guard it, doesn't get any blemishes for 4 days, and that will build their mitzvah repertoire, and that will make them more capable of the Exodus. Now, the Talmud tells us, just a way to understand this, that there's an entirely different model for spiritual acquirement versus physical acquirement. If you want to fill up a jug with water, so if you have a full jug, you can no longer fill it with water. It has to be empty in order for it to hold something in it. So that's the rules in our world. The vessel has to be empty in order for it to be filled. But in the spiritual world, it's the exact opposite. If the vessel is empty, it can't be filled. If the vessel is full, then it can be filled. The idea is that for someone to absorb spiritual messages, they have to be a vessel that is already filled with Torah and mitzvos. The Jewish people are about to go and experience the amazing developments and spiritual messages of the Exodus, and especially of that night when they're going to leave. Therefore, they have to make sure that their spiritual vessels are already filled in order to be capable of absorbing it. Just like if you want to have a vessel that's going to hold something physically, empty it out. If you want a vessel that's capable of holding something spiritual, you have to fill it up prior, and then it can hold things. Pretty remarkable. And this is, I think, broadly, it's a good rule of thumb. The more ignorant someone is about Torah, the more they assume there's nothing for them to learn. Whereas, when someone is more replete with Torah, then they realize how much more there is to learn. The Torah is compared to water. So I once heard an explanation in the name of the Chafetz Chaim that if you want to go to Venice Beach in California and you walk into the water, you say, I can walk from here to Japan. It's only up to my ankles. And indeed, if you just step your toe into Torah, you're like, I got it. This is pretty shallow. It's pretty, it's pretty manageable. It's pretty fixed. But the deeper you go in, the more you realize how much more there is. The more you fill up your spiritual vessel, the more you're capable of filling up, and the broader you expand your spiritual horizons. So everyone does that. This day is going to be a day of remembrance. This is going to be the holiday. This is going to be the mitzvah. 7 days you eat only matzah. But you have to get rid of all the chametz, all the leaven from your house. Anyone who eats leavened food, anyone who eats chametz on the holiday Passover, their soul shall be cut off from Israel. This is verse 19. From the first day to the 7th day. And again, we're told in verse 19 that for 7 days leaven may not be found in your houses. For anyone who eats leavening, that soul shall be cut off from the assembly of Israel. Whether a convert or a native of the land, don't eat any chametz. In all your dwelling, you should eat only matzah. So, of course, we're getting in quick succession the laws of Passover, the laws of eating matzah and not eating chametz. It's interesting here. We say that if someone eats chametz on Pesach, then they get cut off from the Jewish people. That's what it says. And to us, that sounds very excessive. Their soul gets cut off, more specific. That's what the verse says. Now, I think a good way to explain this is that there's just like there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the physical world, there's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the spiritual world. Just like if your body doesn't have oxygen for 4 minutes, you're dead. Food or water, you have to have water every 3 days, or something like that. You have to have food, shelter, etc. Your soul has an equal agenda. It too has hierarchies of needs. And mitzvos are ways to address those needs. We're told that Torah is compared to bread, Torah is compared to water, Torah is compared to oxygen. Torah is almost a multivitamin for your soul. It covers everything. Here, the mitzvah of not eating leaven on Pesach, we're told your soul gets cut off. What it means is that for the 7 days of Pesach, chametz becomes like poison for your soul, and therefore you eat it, it's poison for the soul, your soul gets cut off, it's almost suicide for the soul. That's a good way of understanding that in the spiritual world, it mirrors the physical world, that the things that we do are not just memorials or arbitrary mitzvos because of it's needs that we have internally. Our soul has needs. In fact, we're told that a soul has 613 parts. Each mitzvah corresponds to one part of the soul. Because a mitzvah is there to nourish the soul. We're not doing it for someone else, for our parents, for our rabbis, for God. We're doing it for ourselves. You're feeding your soul just like your motivation for eating breakfast is for yourself. You don't say, I'm eating breakfast because God... Maybe you should say that. I don't know. Maybe that's a mitzvah. But people are not normally attuned to saying that it's for themselves. Mitzvahs are similar, but they're for us. We're not doing them for someone else, for some other entity, to make God happy, to throw God a bone. That's not why. We do it for ourselves to feed our soul. Okay, so Moshe goes and conveys this message to the Jewish people. They get the Passover offering. They prepare their homes for that momentous evening. And God comes and is going to... He tells them, of course, about the future mitzvos, the mitzvah of Passover for eternity. And in verse 29, we're told what actually happens at midnight. So here, and it was at precisely the middle of the night, and God struck the firstborn, every firstborn in the land of Egypt, firstborn of Pharaoh, who's sitting on his throne, the firstborn of a captive in a dungeon, the firstborn of the animals. And Pharaoh wakes up in the middle of the night, him and all his servants and all of Egypt. There's this huge cry, because there isn't a single home that does not have a cadaver. So there's an amazing Rashi here. It's a one-word Rashi, but it really tells a whole story. Verse 30, it says, Pharaoh woke up. Rashi says one word, mimitaso, which means from his bed. And my question always bothered me, what's Rashi contributing to the story? What question is he answering? What do we know now that we don't know prior? Pharaoh woke up from his bed. How does that add? One word, that's it. Rashi's trying to help us understand the verse. Help us understand the text. How is this contributing to the story, to the narrative? And I think it really is a powerful lesson. Moshe has been 9 for 9 with his predictions of plagues. Pharaoh is steadfastly refusing to be impacted by them. Moshe tells him in the middle of the night, around midnight, all the firstborn are going to die. Pharaoh sends him packing. Pharaoh's totally not impressed. Moreover, you would imagine that if Pharaoh was impressionable, he would even consider at least the potential possibility that Moshe may be right. But no. Bedtime comes and Pharaoh gets into his pajamas and gets to bed and goes to sleep like every other night. Pharaoh, his heart was so hard, he was so unimpressionable, that even though Moshe told him, firstborn are going to die, your firstborn are going to die, he was told, it was like any other night. Bedtime comes, you go to bed. Pharaoh thus was in bed, and when this great cry that erupted at midnight, he woke up from his bed. But this shows us Pharaoh's character and the result of a hard heart where someone is really not impacted, and no matter how critical you would imagine, how prudent he should have been to at least get up and be in the control room, be in the war room, and figure out how to respond, at least to the potential threat, Pharaoh's in bed schluffing away. Why did the firstborn, why did they absorb the brunt of the power? So my grandfather says something amazing. He says that a theme throughout the Torah is that the firstborn have a greater spiritual sensitivity. And that's why at the end of the parasha, God says, Kadesh li kol bachar, sanctify for me every firstborn. Firstborn have a natural tendency, an innate connection to spiritual matters. At midnight, there was a revelation of spiritual power. Most people did not have the antenna, the receptors to absorb it. So it just deflected off of them. The firstborn that have a certain innate spiritual capacity, they were impacted by it, they absorbed it, and it was like a jolt of electricity that they couldn't handle and they died. But the firstborn of the Jewish people, they were spared. This is why it says, if you look later on, chapter 13, we talk about the sanctifying the firstborn, because they really should have been susceptible to the same spiritual force that was unleashed. They too should have died, but they were spared miraculously. So, the way I look at the death of the firstborn is that it was part of what God revealed, and it was a byproduct of that, is they couldn't handle it, even though they had some sort of connection to it, and therefore they died, whereas the firstborn of the Jewish people, they were spared. So, it's midnight, there's a dead body in every home. Pharaoh wakes up in his pajamas. He's running through the place trying to find Moshe and Aaron. Indeed, his words were prescient. Moshe and Aaron did not come back to him. He came to them and he instructs them, says, get out of here. I'm evicting you. You, the Jewish people, everyone, go do like what you want. Take your animals, your livestock, your children. Everyone goes and give me a blessing as well. And they are just sending them out so fast. They're forcing them to leave, and they're terrified that they're all going to die. and the people, have their food in the oven getting ready, and they have to pull it out before it's fully done. And that's why they have the matzah, and they're quickly rushed out. It's good thing they were dressed and ready to go. And they take with them from the Egyptians silver, gold, vessels, garments, everything. And like we said, Hashem granted favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. They gave them as much as they can. And verse 37, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkos, 600,000 men, besides for the children. Also, of course, the mixed multitude with them, the flock, and lots of animals. It was a huge procession leaving the land of Egypt. Now, I heard an interesting understanding of the mixed multitude in the name of the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria. If you remember way back on Joseph's time, one of his conditions of dispensing grain during the years of famine was people had to circumcise. And of course, Joseph telling people to circumcise, it wasn't just telling them to undergo a surgery, it was about teaching them about the lessons of circumcision. So he would give lectures to people and teach them about, the idea behind circumcision, which is a broad idea of a spiritual network of life, to say, we're here and we have something that we need to improve and to fix it and to bring God into the world. Apparently, some people were so moved by what Joseph taught them, they were so inspired and galvanized and mobilized, that they actually separated themselves from the Egyptians, and they created like this Noahide movement amongst the Egyptians, where they were righteous Gentiles. And they were inspired by Joseph, and thus they were a separate group amongst the Egyptians. They didn't participate in the torture of the Jewish people, and therefore, when the time for the Exodus came, they were allowed to join the group because of their righteousness. Whereas other Egyptians who maybe were not righteous and wanted to join, they wanted to jump on the bandwagon, they were not allowed to join. Now, I think if you just imagine this, just what kind of, what is this demand of a nation? Yes, it's hard to live in the land of Egypt. And yes, the notion of freedom is really, really enticing preposition. But still, like, you think about it, you have kids, you have livestock, you have your family, and you're walking into the desert. And what's your plan? Israel's already occupied. Not quite the way it's occupied today. There's people and there's empires there. You're walking out of Egypt. Yes, you could leave. What do you have with you? You have matzah for a couple of days? What's the plan? How are you feeding everyone? What about water? We have to appreciate, yes, there's miracles left, right, and center, but it still demands them to jump into this and to commit themselves. Because there's, there is no going back. You might have wanted to go back, but there is no going back. This is it. And do they ask, how are we going to drink? How many water bottles do they bring with them? You're walking into a desert. And historically, we use this decision as an act of bravery, of valor, where they were, submitted themselves to God and committed themselves to the plan. We're going. We have no plans. We're walking into the desert with our kids. What's going to be? We'll rely on God. Okay, middle of the day, they are leaving. And we're told once again that this night is a night of safeguarding. This is the night of protection. The Jewish people are leaving. And indeed, for generations, for eternity, we're going to remember this night, the night we left. And we're told a slew of laws regarding the Pesach offering. Everyone has to eat it. If someone's uncircumcised, they're not allowed to eat it. It has to be eaten in the house. You can't take it out and show your friends. You can't like walk to your neighbors and show them, look what I have. You can't break a bone of it. And all these, by the way, all these mitzvos, they're all to show the new status of the Jewish people. The Jewish people were slaves. Now they're free men. And thus they act with regality, with royalty, as deserved of such people. They don't crack bones and start sucking out marrow. That's not the way, it's not a dignified way of eating. They don't go and show their neighbors, oh, look what I have, look at this meat. You don't show off your meat, even, unless you're someone who doesn't have it that frequently. Also, They're told you can't cook it. You have to roast it. What happens when you cook something? It stays the same size. You take a huge piece of meat, you put it on the grill, and it was like this earlier, and it shrinks. But it's tastier, but it's smaller. And if someone who's poor, they're trying to think, how do I maximize my calories? I need to have as much food as I can get. Whereas someone who's a king, they become a connoisseur. They want to have the tastiest. And all these mitzvahs are all to show that we are now kings. We're leaving the land of Egypt. And thus, even during our Seder that we do in modern times, we lean, we drink wine. We're trying to demonstrate that, at least for that night, we are like kings. We're given more mitzvahs, a mitzvah to remember the Exodus. We're told twice in chapter 13, mitzvah of tefillin. Again, this is going to be a launching site of all mitzvahs. All mitzvahs, because really all of faith and all of our nation is established here and now. And that's why the tefillin, what's tefillin? Tefillin is like a jewelry that is proclaiming the Exodus. If you open up a tefillin, you'll see four scrolls, and it records these verses. Chapter 13. Chapter 13 has two of the sections, from verse 1 to verse 10, and from verse 11 to verse 16. Those are two of the sections inside the tefillin compartments. And it says, you wear the tefillin to remember the Exodus. And by the way, holidays are to remember the Exodus. And a whole slew of mitzvahs are to remember the Exodus, because this is the transformation of a people, of a tribe, of a family, into a nation. Because a nation is not just about the people and the genetics, so to speak. It's about the ideals. And the ideals are faith, submission to God. And that relationship between the Jewish nation and God is started right over here. And thus the mitzvahs are there to maintain the bond that began there. And that's why all the mitzvahs are referencing back to that time. It's almost like you have an anniversary. It's the anniversary of the beginning of the relationship. This is the beginning of the relationship. The mitzvahs are our celebrations, our milestones, our markers, our watershed moments where we stop and say, we have a relationship with God. It began with the Exodus, and thus we're keeping the light aflame. We're keeping the warmth. We're maintaining and preserving the relationship that was started then and there. There is a commentary on the Ramban. I don't have time to read it. I was planning on reading it, but my grandfather, of blessed memory, he said that every Jew should memorize this Ramban, this statement of the Ramban. I don't have it memorized, but I figured we could at least read it. But I guess we'll have to do it, each one of us on our own. But this Ramban, he discusses the significance of the Exodus in Jewish life. All of Jewish life is always referencing back to the Exodus. We see this again. The mitzvahs are all here, and indeed, holidays are all oriented about the Exodus. We have multiple holidays. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we all say Zechus Mitzrayim. Shabbos, we say remembering Mitzrayim, Egypt. Passover, Sukkot, Shavuot, all of them we reference going back to Egypt. Egypt, indeed, what's happening over here is the foundations of faith of the nation. And thus, having a touch point with it throughout our life, throughout our day, and throughout our year brings us back to that status and reminds us of what we already know. It's almost as if someone knows something, but they're apt to forget it, they put little signs. It's almost like there's a motion picture about a guy who loses his memory. So he puts signs all over to remind him of stuff. We're like that. We saw the Exodus and we were wowed. And we're like, I'm changing my life. But then we start forgetting. We have amnesia. We start forgetting it. So in order to not forget it, we put these little signposts all over our life. Every time we pass a mezuzah, what does it say to mezuzah? It says we left Egypt. Remember. Tefillin, you wrap it to your head. Shema, you say morning at night. Every Shabbos, you have a whole day of remembering it. Because, yes, we saw fantastic things, but we're conditioned to forget it. And when we forget it, we can be totally oblivious of things that are the most important for us. And therefore, we need to put reminders everywhere to have signposts on our door and on our head and all these signs throughout our life, not to forget the Exodus and what we knew and what is so important.